Thomas Giglione, thank you so much for coming on the documentary Can ODR Change the World? The Story and Promise of Online Dispute Resolution. So, welcome. I look forward to hearing from your perspective how ODR can change the world as a final question. But before I get there, I'd like for you to just take us back to go through your own personal story and slowly bring us up to speed about your interactions with technology and how online dispute resolution has impacted you and how you've impacted it as well. So this is pretty, I guess, laid back. It's your story. It's your story time. So you get to help steer where this goes. But go ahead. Why don't you just start off with your personal story, who you are, where you're from, where you've lived, and then we'll slowly get into the tech.
Hello, Mac. Thank you for the opportunity. I'm Thomas Giglione. I grew up in Toronto. I'm back and living in Toronto now after traveling 18 years, teaching various universities, faculties of law, teaching mediation and ODR, negotiation skills. I'm a court appointed roster mediator with the Ministry of the Attorney General since 2001. I initially founded Upper Canada Dispute Resolution back in 2001, and now I'm the CEO and run We Agree Mediators in Toronto. We handle workplace investigations, commercial disputes, some family stuff. Right now, I'm helping launch a new corporate service with a theater company that mixes forum theater with mediation, nonviolent communication, and DEI work. So companies can fix the conflict before it turns into a formal complaint or a lawsuit. Because nothing says smart business like waiting until the lawyers show up and start the meter running.
Well, thank you, for giving us a little bit about the present. So let's go into the past. When did you first start mediations? And I assume that back then the technology in mediation and ODR was not the same as it is today. So could you kind of give us a lay of the land about your early days with mediation in general and ADR?
Right. Well, back when I started 25 years ago, the social media was not the thing, and mobile phones and internet was in its infancy. I started out as one of the first mediators in Ontario's mandatory mediation program. Um, I I had a hobby as a private pilot at the time that pulled me into teaching crisis negotiation around the world, bomb threats, hijackings, terrorism, the whole show. That work took me to around the world to Iran first, and later Vietnam, where I met my wife. She was an air traffic controller there. She's actually one of the first female air traffic controllers in Vietnam. We clicked while figuring out how to keep everyone alive under the worst pressure imaginable. From there, it snowballed. I spent 12 years plus in Vietnam as a senior conflict resolution specialist. I was also a court appointed mediator. I was the only non Vietnamese court appointed mediator in Vietnam. I trained corporate teams there. I spent 3 years in China and also taught in Argentina. Along the way, I started amateur theater groups in Nanjing and Hanoi because wherever I stay long enough, I cannot help it. Um, a Canadian mediator doesn't usually end up on four continents, but once you start teaching people how you stay calm when everything's on fire, the invitations keep coming, and one thing leads to another. And funny how the world works and how life is.
Yeah, well, the airline industry, I guess, is gonna be what connects the world and the most, right? So you having started in that industry, no surprise that you'd then be connected to all these different places teaching conflict resolution. So take me back to when you first started with technology. How did you first think? What was the instance where you first thought to yourself, you know what? Technology can actually be used to resolve disputes. Like when did that do you remember where you were, I guess?
Right. Well, uh, I use technology in crisis negotiations because there was software specific for that.
Mhm.
And so that skill set opened doors everywhere. it taught me something I still use every day in mediation. So when emotions are sky high, you focus on the one thing everyone can agree on right now. It beats yelling at each other across a courtroom for years. So basically, that technology intersected with with my mediation, and I thought there was technology was very powerful. And I look at mediation, ODR specifically, as very transformative. It's kind of like, if I give you an analogy, it's how podcasts have kind of affected legacy media. Basically, legacy media um, is now, podcasts are more about a conversation. That's what mediation is about,
Mhm.
and it's transformed. Podcasts have transformed the media that we know of, and I believe ODR has done the same thing in transforming negotiations and ODR.
So tell me, go back to the Vietnam, era just a little bit. When you first arrived there, what was the state of mediation there, and then how had it changed by the time you left?
Yeah. Basically, when I arrived in Vietnam, mediation was basically brand new. The country had the laws on paper. Actually, they took um, a lot of the civil procedures from Canada. Canada was one of the principal participants in transforming the legal system in Vietnam, but they had laws on paper. It was basically a civil justice system, but almost no practical experience. None of the lawyers knew very much about it. It was all on paper as theory. So I helped build it from the ground up as a senior conflict resolution specialist, and I started I organized the largest mediation ADR conference in Southeast Asia back in 2012 with 350 delegates to kind of break the mold, break the ice.
Mhm.
We had like 10 workshops. It ran 3 days, and we had mediators from around the world. And I started doing guest lecturing at the judicial academies and universities, Hanoi and Saigon, training teams in the corporate world, like Bao Viet Insurance, BIDV Bank, Viettel Mobile. Um, we started with the basics. I wrote articles on mediation in Vietnam. I watched it grow into something real now. Now it's viable. Um, it turns out you can import the idea faster than the courts can process the paperwork. Um, and yeah, basically now I would say mediation and ODR is just as advanced as it is in North America.
So I spent time with another guest on China, and we were talking about the Hangzhou courts. We were talking about the development of ODR there. It's less like free market based like the U.S. and other countries are doing, and it's more centralized, where the government authorities are realizing, look, this makes sense. We have to, because of the population size, because of the number of disputes, we have to funnel people through a process that's mechanized and that's going to help people resolve their disputes as quick as possible. Because you also lived in China for a few years, you kind of have a broad view of being able to compare how ODR developed in China and how it developed in Vietnam, where you had lived. Could you speak to that briefly about the similarities or differences between China and Vietnam when it comes to mediation broadly, and I guess ODR specifically?
Okay, well, I traveled about 12 different countries teaching ODR and mediation, and every culture handles conflict differently. In China, as you know, saving face is everything. So you learn to give people an exit ramp that lets them keep their dignity. Also,
Mhm.
China is more tech savvy. The people are more tech savvy. When I was in China, um, I used, their currency, their paper currency. Now you don't use the only people that use paper currency in China are the tourists.
Mm,
Everything is on apps, as you know. Um, so the culture is very different in each country. So Vietnam is lagging a little bit in that, but it's catching up. In Argentina, it was more passionate and direct.
mm.
Stay in Canada. If I stayed in Canada instead of you know traveling and teaching around the world, it would have kept me inside one comfortable box. Working across those places showed me mediation is not one size fits all. You adapt the process to the people, not the other way around. Otherwise, you're just exporting Toronto boardroom, courtroom rules and wondering why nobody shows up.
Well, you mentioned saving face. So in Vietnam as well, there's that cultural concept, like you mentioned it in China. And how does that affect how people approach mediation? And does it make ODR easier, do you think, to introduce or more difficult?
Well, saving face makes mediation essential because nobody wants to lose publicly. So ODR actually helps there. People can speak more freely online without the immediate pressure of someone staring at them across a table. It
Mm,
lowers the temperature and lets everyone save face while still reaching an agreement. Courts make you do it in person with everyone watching, and it becomes a public record for everyone to see. So when you have that, nobody wants to play, and everybody gets intimidated. And culturally, there are differences. People, Asian people tend to be, a little more timid at first and have different negotiation styles. And you have to be in tune with the different cultural nuances with different negotiation styles. And it's a real learning experience for me, actually. Um, I was Richard Feynman said, famous physicist, he said the best way to learn something is to teach something.
hmm.
And in my teaching, I learned, teaching different countries, I learned the different nuances and the different ways that people negotiate cross culturally. When you're dealing with them, it creates a whole different um, realm that's very challenging. And especially, I dealt with a lot of cross-border negotiations, and ODR fits perfectly with that type of conflict.
Yes. So let's turn to online dispute resolution more specifically. So, from your vantage point, and I believe you lived during the COVID years in Vietnam, right?
Yeah.
And so we've touched on um, the pandemic and how it impacted the rush to address mediations online. We touched on it with all the speakers who have come on so far. And so, because you were in Vietnam during those years, so from your vantage point, having watched ODR develop in Vietnam through the COVID years, and now watching it from back home in Canada, when did ODR become a serious conversation in parts of the world that you worked in? Was the shift happening before COVID, or did the pandemic force it?
That's a great question, Mac. I would say, I'm thinking a little bit about it. I would say it was already stirring before COVID, really, especially in Vietnam with the e-commerce explosion. The pandemic just hit the accelerator.
Mm,
Suddenly, everyone needed to resolve disputes, but they're getting on a plane or sitting in the same room in a court. The backlog in Vietnam for court ast- is 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 crazy. It's worse than it is in North America.
mm,
That is when the conversation went from theoretical to everyday, and access to justice gap became impossible to ignore. It turns out a global shutdown is what it took for people to notice the courts were already too slow. The
mm.
process was already too slow. So it was already stirring before COVID, but like I said, COVID hit the accelerator on the whole process.
So you mentioned e-commerce earlier. Southeast Asia has the highest e-commerce share of total retail sales anywhere of any region in the world. With that kind of growth, how serious is the need for ODR in Vietnam and the surrounding countries right now? And is there infrastructure to keep it up?
Yeah, well, the growth is insane, as you mentioned. Vietnam and the region lead the world in e-commerce share of retail sales. So that creates millions of small disputes every month. The infrastructure is catching up fast, but there's still a huge gap between the volume of online transactions and the tools to fix problems quickly. Uh, Forget about traditional courts. They're too slow, too expensive, and too far away for most people. That's exactly where I think ODR shines, because expecting everyone to fly to a courthouse is adorable, but not exactly practical, especially when you're dealing with cross-border stuff, suppliers in another country, you know, um, it just doesn't work. So ODR shines in when it comes to e-commerce. When you're traveling to different countries, you have to try different different tools from the mediator's toolbox, and a
Hmm.
lot of those tools cannot be it's not one size fits all. So traveling, actually, I learned more about mediation and ODR through my cultural experiences than I did in any training that I've undergone. um uh, so for example, when I was on the ground, teaching, preventing bullying in a private high school, I tried to pull out a different tool from the toolbox to help in, transform and train people in that area. And I mentioned to you before, alongside mediation, I directed amateur theater using
Yeah. Yeah, we're going to
Auguste
get there.
Paul
Yes.
Theater of the Oppressed. And I took that toolbox and I used it, and it's developed now even much further, and it's something that I never imagined
Hmm.
using in mediation. So in the different cultural perspectives, you are forced to be resourceful.
Hmm.
Um, I did this work in Vietnam with the Nanjing Theater Group and Hanoi's Amsterdam High School to prevent bullying and cyberbullying. I started amateur theater groups wherever I stayed long enough, because theater brings people together when everything else is pulling them apart. Now I'm bringing back here in Toronto with a theater company that specializes in organizational conflict.
Hmm.
We're launching a new corporate service that takes the same idea and adds a layer called a legislative theater, which is a political tool used to change municipal and uh, federal legislation, um, and we convert it to policy, corporate policy.
So, one of the things that I've always been thankful for you about is that you've introduced me to a lot of people, who connected me to a lot of people. I know when you started We Agree Mediators, it's a big focus into ODR, a big push into technology, using technology to resolve differences. And so you host your own podcast. You've been on my podcast. You've connected me. I think you were the one who introduced on video, me to Colin Rule, to Robert Berkman, to Samuel Dehaan, Graham Ross, out in the UK. So I always
Yeah.
appreciate you for all those things. Thank you so much.
Yes.
You never know who you know until you make connections for people. So that being said, um, AI is changing mediation in real time. What are you seeing, and what gives you hope, and what leaves you awake at night when it comes to AI and this new world of mediation?
Well, absolutely. It's already starting to, when you combine online dispute resolution with artificial intelligence, like LLMs such as Claude,
Mm,
that have connectors now straight into legal websites. Like, for example, I'm using a website called minicounsel.ca,
mm,
where they don't have a lot of hallucination and everything shifts. Parties get instant realistic scenarios. They see likely outcomes without waiting years and spending a fortune. Legacy legal practice built on billable hours and delays start to look obsolete pretty fast.
mm.
The real win is access to justice for me. That's
Yeah.
why I got into mediation, is access to justice. That's why I'm on this website. It's called JusticeNet in Canada,
Mm,
where it's a service that opens mediation to people who are too squeezed for the full rates. For It has lawyers, paralegals, mediators like myself, but do not qualify for legal aid. More people can actually resolve their conflicts instead of staying stuck. That's how ODR integrated with AI changes the world,
Mm,
one fair agreement at a time. That loop makes justice fast, cheap, and reachable instead of something only the wealthy or the patient can afford. Yes, ODR can change the world by making justice reachable for the millions um, in the courts have left behind. Um, so um, I like out of all the LLMs, I've tried all of them. You and I have been talking about, AI for several years now, and I'm working mostly using Claude Claude now because I really like that it's not just a prompt. It's more connectors and skills
mm.
and such. And I notice all the other LLMs are working towards that. And I like how, um, especially in Ontario, in the Superior Court, now they will, if you don't check any precedents that are verified. There was a lot of media hype about lawyers using,
Mhm.
and clients using, false
Yeah,
precedents and such.
and false
Now
cases.
the Ontario courts are very strict about that you need to check that, you're using correct precedents and it's not hallucinated by AI. Um, Now the courts are waking up to this, the Ontario court is, and saying, "Look, guys, you got to check,
Mm.
whether or not this precedent fits this case." And now I'm finding that the courts are aware that AI has been integrated with the legal system.
So, Thomas, when it comes to AI, talk to me about your work specifically in it and how it connects to ODR. So, I know that you've built We Agree mediators. Can you talk to us? What is it, and why did you build it? When did the ideas come to you? Just take us through that story.
Yeah, basically, I first saw when I got introduced with AI. I got used to the idea that the magic came not from the answers, but the questions that you asked.
Mm,
And I noticed it was a time saver because often you have to, when you're doing mediation, you have to read hundreds of pages and you could basically, summarize what are the most important ones. And for me, I integrated that into my company as a way to make myself uh, more with better efficacy, not only as a mediator, an ODR practitioner, but also as a trainer. So it was a time saving tool where I learned that it was not just like asking Google, certain things that I got versed into prompt writing and basically using prompt writing, sophisticated prompt writing to become more efficient in what I did in to save the client money too, because it would involve less prep time for training. It would involve less um, more focused questions on my side that I could tweak.
mhm,
Um, so I view it as not a tool to replace lawyers, mediators, paralegals, but a tool to make us better in what we do in our profession.
mm,
Um, so basically, I remember seeing something on LinkedIn. It said AI took my job.
mm.
That was the heading. AI took my job, and
Yeah.
then there was below it to another level. And I feel AI is doing that. It's taking what we do to another level. And now,
Yes.
Zoom has integrated, the tools into the Zoom now that where you do summaries and, snippets um, and you've integrated uh, and developed your own program that integrates with Zoom. So AI has kind of trickled into every facet And I mentioned Claude. Claude now you could connect to my Google Drive.
Mhm.
I could connect to, my calendar, my Gmail. All that makes it, I feel like half the time I'm looking for documents and looking for the specific uh, precedent or the specific um, question to come up with. And sometimes uh, AI could help me tweak the specific question to uh, instead of having 10 different questions um, in a mediation where most lawyers want to rush through it and don't want to go through the whole process of mediation. They're usually not very, how do I say it, patient going through the whole process. That's from my general experience working with lawyers in mediation. They like to kind of rush things through. Let's get on with this type of thing. And AI has helped me into try to um, expedite things and make things move a little bit faster through the mediation process.
Gotcha. So we're starting to wrap up now. And before I get to the last question about the future and what you anticipate with regards to ODR, was there anything that I didn't ask you that probably I should have, or that you would want me to have asked you?
Um, Basically, where this is going,
Yeah.
and yeah, I think i- uh, I think it's a. I think AI is a threat to humanity. I really believe that, and I side with most of the experts.
Mhm.
But we got I think it's a threat mostly to our children,
Mhm.
not to ourselves yet. And I think we can use it to um, become better. And I really believe that if you're pushing paper or you're doing, most of your job is writing emails and um, checking calendar and all those things. If most of your work is that, your job's going to be obsolete. I think it's already happening. And in China, the courts are almost totally AI now. Totally AI. AI is making arbitration decisions, which is unbelievable. Um, you're going to see less privacy because of it. You're going to see algorithms uh, infiltrating and getting into case law. It's going to be seeping into everything, and we have no control over it. And basically, we're going to be pawns, um, and most of our jobs will become obsolete.
So
That's the future, I believe.
So when you know that there's a lot of work being done when it comes to governance of AI and creating standards in the mediation world, for example, Leah Wing, the director of National Center for Technology Dispute Resolution, NCTDR, Daniel Rainey, they've recently written books, about this kind of thing, about how do we address this dystopian, future that you've kind of described. How do we make sure that we're not taken for a ride by AI? Can you speak to that a little bit? What are your thoughts about some things we should probably try to do before it gets too late?
Um, I don't wanna be critical of, anyone's work, but
Sure.
I think it's patchwork. I think the genie's out of the box. We have the internet, but we also have the dark web.
Hmm.
And yes, the European Union is very strong on,
Hmm.
putting this genie back and controlling it out of the box, but we still have viruses. We have still malware. We still have all those bad players around. It's kind of like, it's gonna uh, it's gonna be like Mac. What is
Yeah,
it?
whack-a-mole, whack-a-mole.
Whack a
Right.
mole type of thing, and it's all gonna be. It looks pretty, but it's I think the genie's out of the bottle, and,
So what would
it
your solutions be? More government oversight, more legislation, or do you think even that is not gonna resolve the concerns?
no, I think we're into Terminator world now. No, I really do. I think it's unstoppable. I really do. Yeah. Look at North Korea. They tried to cap the internet, you know, they couldn't do it. Look at Russia now. They're trying to stifle the internet. The people are finding Telegram. They're finding different ways.
Yeah.
It's whack-a-mole. I think it's something that is uncontrollable, and this is just a facade of controlling it. And I think people like Sam Altman, they have ulterior motives.
Mm.
And I'm glad, I don't know, my personal perspective, I'm glad Elon Musk is taking him to court. And I think Elon Musk, he's a very controversial figure, but he sees the threat, and he sees the hypocrisy, and he's mentioned it a few times about where AI is and where it's going, and yeah, I, I don't admire everything he does, and such, but I feel that he has the true perspective, instead of the facade of what is happening as far as trying to uh, uh, create governance over
Mm.
AI. And I think the genie's out of the bottle.
So let's talk about online dispute resolution and how it has changed the world or the ways it will. So, AI aside, and the way things are going, when we bring and pull AI into the construct of mediation, conflict resolution, can you just end with that? What are your thoughts about how online mediation can or will change the world?
I think it's going to be seamless. It's going to be like, for example, like, I'll give you an example, like PayPal and Amazon. Amazon went from selling books to now selling everything, right? And now they've integrated AI in their dispute resolution. And whenever there's algorithms are basically gonna make everything seamless. So we're not even gonna be aware that we're be involved in a dispute. For example, I don't know, there's Fiverr and Freelancer, right? Freelancer
Mm.
has a dispute resolution mechanism between a freelancer and the client. And now they've introduced AI, and now it's almost become seamless. Before, they used to have deadlines when you had to submit your position, just like in a mediation or arbitration, where now it's like AI is pulling that information before you can even submit it. So I think it's going to be, over the next year or so, a lot of the e-commerce and ODR is going to be completely seamless. You're not going to be aware that there was even a conflict, that it will be resolved before you actually could imagine the conflict. So it's going to transform everything. Workplace disputes, um, you know, look at Claude. Claude wants to know everything about you before you set up the prompting. And so why does it want to know everything about me? Well, it wants to know what conflicts me, what my personality, with the way I think, my cultural identity, now with international identity and all the rest of it, it's going to be so seamless, so integral, that we're not going to even know that we're even part of a mediation ODR process. I want to explain how it will become seamless. Right, everything is algorithms now, right? And like with Claude that I'm using specifically, they want to find out about my algorithm, what it is that about my personality, about my cultural identity, and that will be inputted into whatever conflict scenario that I would deal with, myself as a mediator or myself as a participant. I want to give you an example. When I do these role plays, workplace dispute role plays, I I also incorporate system design. So basically, it's I don't just write a report. It's basically, how can we redesign policy? How can we redesign the workplace so these kinds of things could be, there's 80/20 rule, that 80% of of the disputes are caused by
Mhm.
well, yeah, is called, the 80-20 rule, where you basically focus on what is the majority of the issues that come, that become issues in an organization or a mediation, and there are algorithms that come into play that figures this out. So, basically, it not only solves that specific issue, but also is preventative. It does, systems design where those algorithms are used to incorporate and change software to change the e-commerce system, so those disputes will be minimized, that they won't come up as often. You know, so
Yeah.
basically, I think AI will make it so uh, eventually, like, it will nip things in the bud, so to speak, before things get out of hand.
All right, Thomas Giglione, thank you so much for coming on this documentary. Can ODR change the world? And I appreciate your thoughts as always. And we talked for about an hour, but you said a lot. And
Okay,
we
Matt.
will put it together so that the audience can watch later. All right, sir. Thank you. I'm stopping the recording.
Okay, thanks, Matt.